You mentioned we're in a big bubble. Can you elaborate on that, and how is this likely to play out?
Well, I think eventually there'll be considerable trouble because of the wretched excess. That's the way it's usually worked in the past. But when it's going to come and how bad it will be, I can't tell you.
Steve Kospel writes in on this same subject. He says, what are your current thoughts on the inflationary environment? And please compare and contrast it to the 1970s.
When Volcker, after the 70s, took the prime rate to 20% and the government was paying 15% on its government bonds, that was a horrible recession. Lasted a long time, caused a lot of agony. And I certainly hope we're not going there again. I think the conditions that allowed Volcker to do that without an interference from the politicians were very unusual. And I think in 2020 hindsight, it was a good thing that he did it. I would not predict that our modern politicians will be as willing to permit a new Volcker to get that tough with the economy and bring on that kind of a recession. So I think the new troubles are likely to be different from the old troubles.
This is related. These are all.
You may wish you had a Volcker. You may wish you had a Volcker-style recession instead of what you're going to get. The troubles that come to us could be worse than what Volcker was dealing with, and harder to fix.
Like what? Have you
think of all the Latin American countries that print too much money. They get strongmen and so forth. That's what Plato said happened in the early Greek city-state democracies. One person, one vote, a lot of equality, and you get demagogues, and the demagogues lather up the population, and pretty soon you don't have your democracy anymore. I don't think that was a crazy idea on Plato's part. I think that accurately described what happened in Greece way back then, and it's happened again and again and again in Latin America. We don't want to go there.
This is something from Simon Jacobs, who says, conventional economic theory argues that excessive monetary and fiscal stimulus over the last 2 years has triggered the highest inflation in 40 years. Do you broadly agree with this thesis? And more importantly, do you think there will be a high economic price to pay as the Fed attempts to bring inflation back under control? I guess the reasons for it.
Well, the first part, I agree with it. We've done something pretty extreme, and we don't know how bad the troubles will be, whether we're going to be like Japan or something a lot worse. And what makes life interesting is we don't know how it's going to work out. I think we do know we're flirting with serious trouble. I think we also know that some of our earlier fears were overblown. Japan is still existing as a civilized nation, in spite of unbelievable excess by all former standards in terms of money printing. Think of how seductive it is. You have a bunch of interest-bearing debts, and you pay them off with checking accounts, which you're no longer paying interest. Think of how seductive that is for a bunch of legislators. You get rid of the interest payments and the money supply goes up. It seems like heaven. And of course, when things get that seductive, they're likely to be overused.
How will this all play out? And what's the best advice you have for individual investors to optimally deal with the negative impact of inflation other than owning quality equities?
It may be that you have to choose the least bad of a bunch of options. That frequently happens in human decision making. And the Mungers have Berkshire stock, Costco stock, Chinese stocks through Lilu, a little bit of Daily Journal stock, and a bunch of apartment houses. Do I think that's perfect? No. Do I think it's okay? Yes. I think the great lesson from the Mungers is you don't need all this damn diversification. That's plenty of. You're lucky if you've got 4 good assets. I think the finance professors and that sell the idea that perfect diversification is professional investment, if you're trying to do better than average, you're lucky if you have 4 things to buy. And to ask for 20 is really asking for egg in your beer. It's very few people can have enough brains to get 20 good investments.
Charts, technicals, momentum, and AI seem to dominate the market these days. Are old school Ben Graham valuation methods dead?
They'll never die. You can't. The idea of getting more value than you pay for, that's what investment is. If you want to be successful, you have to get more value than you pay for. And so it's never going to be obsolete. Now, you can get a whole body of people that don't even know what they're buying. They're just quotations on the ticker. I don't think it's helpful to have, think of the past crazy booms and how they worked out. The South Seas bubble, the bubble in the late 20s, so on and so on. We've had this since the dawn of capitalism. We've had crazy bubbles.
Leonard Mikowski writes in, he says he's a mechanical engineer from Germany. Do you think it's likely that we will experience a major increase in interest rates in the upcoming decades, like, for example, in the period between 1950 and 1980?
Well, that, of course, is a very intelligent question and a very difficult question. When you throw money, when you print money on the scale that modern nations are printing it, Japan, the United States, Europe, etc., we're getting into new territory in terms of size. The Japanese bought back not only a lot of their own debt, but a lot of their common stocks. So the Federal Reserve System, you can't imagine how much money printing Japan has done. They haven't had all that much inflation, and it's still a very admirable civilization. In fact, you could argue that Japan is one of the more admirable civilizations in the whole world. And in spite of all this very extreme government money printing they've done, and they haven't had terrible consequences. Now they've had 25 years of stasis with living standards not improving very much. I don't think that came from their macroeconomic policies. I think that came from the rise of tough competition for their export powerhouse from China and Korea. But at any rate, it's weird what's happening, and nobody knows for sure how it's going to work out. I think it's encouraging that Japan can print as much money as it has and remain as civilized and calm and admirable as it has. And so I hope to God the United States has similar happy outcome. But I think the Japanese are better adapted for stasis than we are. I think it's a duty-filled, civilized bunch of people, a lot of them older, not many young people, and they just suck it in and cope. In our country, we have terrible tensions. It's way harder to run a country which is not monoethnic like Japan. There's some professor at Harvard that has written extensively on this subject. It's way harder to run a nation like the United States with different ethnicities and groups and so forth than it is to run Japan. Japan is basically sort of a monoethnic civilization which is proud of its ethnicity, and of course they can cope with the troubles better than some other people can.
Charlie, Steve
But
Kospel
we don't know where we're going. There's never been anything quite like what we're doing now. And we do know from what's happened in other nations, if you try and print too much money, it eventually causes terrible trouble. And we're closer to terrible trouble than we've been in the past, but it may still be a long way off. I certainly hope so.
Me too.